All right, Ryan, let's go to Indianapolis and talk about the quarterback situation there. We've been talking about Anthony Richardson a lot, in part because he hasn't quite turned into the player that we had all hoped he would be, just because of inconsistency. Nothing really more than that, except for the injuries. And his surgically repaired throwing shoulder started to give him some soreness during OTAs in late May, so he's going to rest that thing. Hopefully, he'll be ready for training camp. But and I had our buddy Rick Spielman mention this to me throughout the process of evaluating players. When guys are hurt in college, typically they're hurt in the pros, and that appears to be the situation with Anthony Richardson. I don't know what the workaround is because you're invested in this young man. He's a top 5 pick, but where do you go from here if you're the Colts and trying to figure out what your quarterback situation is going to be for the next 1 to 5 years?
Well, this is why they signed Daniel Jones and made the investment in Daniel Jones, because they knew that this could be a possibility. And unfortunate for him, like, this is just what his career has been. You go back to the University of Florida, and just when you started to get excited about what Anthony Richardson can bring, it was a hamstring, it was a knee, it was an ankle. So it was always something in terms of injuries. And so now we're right there, again with this, the shoulder. His shoulder injury that happened to him his rookie year actually came against the Titans in a game in Indianapolis. And so, those type of things, the bones and stuff, like, you can't do anything about that. But it's like now you're in a position for him that you maybe want to start tweaking his offseason preparation and what is he doing, and is he throwing too much? And what is his lifting regimen like? If you've ever seen him in person, he has the athletic build. He has, that rocked up frame. And maybe it's time to switch from banging weights to doing more mobility and more stretching thing to keep those muscles and ligaments loose.
So if you're the general manager and this happens over the summer and he has the history of getting injured, have you had the conversations, or do you plan on having the conversations when everyone's back in the building in July and August? Talking to the scouts about, okay, before you guys hit the road, let's be extra vigilant about looking at these quarterbacks, or are we too early in the process for that?
No, I think as GM, I think you put it on yourself to start that process. I think it's too early to put it on the scouts. And listen, the scouts read everything. They see everything. They watch With the First Pick podcast, so they know what we're talking about. And so they're going to do the work. And the one thing I've learned in the scouting community is when you go into an off season or you go into a season of scouting with a position that is a weakness, then you tend to over scout, you tend to overgrade people, and it puts a completely different value because that position is such a position of need that you kind of tend to run some guys up on the board just to be safe. And you never know what's going to be facing you when it's time to pull that card off the board. So I would leave the scouts alone for now. Let them continue to do their summer scouting. Let them continue to do, their preseason stuff so you can get the information. But as a GM, I would grab my top 2 lieutenants and say, hey, probably time to jump down in the bunker and, into our situation room, and let's watch these quarterbacks and have a good feel for them as we enter the fall.
And to your point, Chris Ballard went out and got Daniel Jones for that reason. So it gives you a little buffer in terms of not having to overreact or overpay for a quarterback right now. You can roll with Daniel Jones. They drafted Riley Leonard in the 5th round. So you have a little wiggle room as you try to navigate 2025. Hopefully AR5 can get healthy and stay healthy. But that has yet to be the case over at least the course of the season. Speaking of injuries, let's go to Atlanta and Kirk Cousins, who a year ago was the starter and 10 months ago was the starter without knowing that they were going to draft Michael Penix Jr., and now Michael Penix Jr. is the starter, and we got to figure out where Kirk Cousins lands. And it feels like right now, Rand, it's either going to be one of 2 places. Either he's going to be the backup in Atlanta, and they're just going to pay him, and they seem to be okay with that, or you have to wait for perhaps, unfortunately, a training camp injury or an early season injury to a quarterback that's potentially a starter elsewhere, and then make that deal happen. And if that happens, I'm guessing the big question is, all right, how are we going to split up paying Kirk Cousins if we're the Falcons and whoever team B ends up being?
So I want to start from a different perspective, right? Okay. Because as we can see on the tagline, it says, what's going on with Kirk Cousins? There's nothing going on with Kirk Cousins, right? This is all out of his control. He has nothing to do with this. And at this point, it comes down to the Atlanta Falcons and what they're going to ultimately decide about his future. And again, we talk about it all the time on this show. it's easy to say, hey, we should trade this guy, or we want to trade this guy, but you have to have a partner. And right now, the Falcons may not just have a partner. Now, I'm sure they had conversations with the Steelers, maybe, during this Aaron Rodgers saga, but now Aaron Rodgers has a home. He's in Pittsburgh. So that doesn't leave Atlanta with very many options. And like you talked about, they've already budgeted for carrying Kirk Cousins' number, throughout this season. So it's not going to bother them per se to have him on the roster in terms of a cap standpoint. So they already have that budgeted. But again, there's other extenuating things that come up. If you do have a trade partner, what's that going to look like? I'm sure the pick it will be a hard pick, but it's going to be a conditional pick based on how much he plays. And then how high is the pick going to be? Are they going to have to pay down some of that? Will Atlanta pay down some of that? We don't know. We're not privy to those conversations. But to say what's going on with Kirk Cousins, this isn't a Kirk Cousins problem or issue. This is more of an Atlanta Falcons issue right now.
Exactly. And just so we're clear, any team that trades for Cousins is going to take on his guaranteed salary for 2025, which is $27.5 million, and then potentially future guaranteed money if his contract isn't restructured. So those, again, that's complicating this situation in terms of what that means for his future. Let me ask you this, Rand. So you talked about maybe the Steelers checked in with the Falcons, but it feels like the conversation has been almost all about Aaron Rodgers since the draft in terms of the Pittsburgh connection there. All else being equal, and we'll just assume that Kurt and Aaron are equal health coming off that Achilles injury, even though Kurt's happened later than Aaron's did. But if you're the Steelers, who would you rather have, taking everything into account, the age, the off-field stuff, the mobility on the field, all that other stuff? If you're the Steelers, who makes the most sense? Would you rather have Kirk Cousins or roll with Aaron Rodgers?
I think it's one of those things where you do the pros and the cons, because there's going to be pros and cons with it both ways. But if I'm making a decision, you got to roll with the future Hall of Famer, because you've seen him do it on a big stage. And hey, listen, every team that Kirk Cousins has ever went to, probably with the exception of Washington, has been willing to pay him and pay him for his services. So you can love him or hate him, but Kirk Cousins has won games in this league. However, the big problem for Kirk Cousins has been winning in big games. And so that's always been the issue. And you've seen Aaron Rodgers, win those big games. He has a Lombardi to his name. And so you have to err on the side of that. Now, again, probably if you can mix and match, you would take Kirk Cousins probably off field, quote unquote, home life, if you will, over Aaron Rodgers. But again, like even some of that, we've never heard Aaron Rodgers' teammates say they hate him, or they dislike him. We've never heard that. It's just Aaron Rodgers is an outspoken person about issues and topics that the rest of us won't touch or don't touch, publicly. And it just ruffles some feathers. So I don't know. Again, it doesn't feel like a Pittsburgh Steeler type of guy just based off of the history of the organization. But if you're comparing these two, you got to always err on the side of the future Hall of Famer and a guy that you've seen win big games.